Hey guys, it's Morgan Archer, and I am doing my final oral presentation for Dr. Grantham's EPSY 7210 Multicultural Gifted Education course. So for the final exam, we have been asked to complete 3 tasks, the first of which is to identify 2 goals or objectives from the course syllabus and describe how we met the goals through our experience and throughout the course. My 2 examples include Objective 1 and I believe 4 from the syllabus. To talk about Objective 1, it is to recognize prejudice and oppressive institutional structures in education that marginalize gifted students from culturally diverse backgrounds, specifically race, class, gender, and language issues. I'll go ahead and say that I took the objectives, wrote them down, and started listing all of the things that I recognize that contribute to this institutional structural marginalization of this culturally diverse gifted group of students. And I realized at the end of the day, or at the end of the whole 20 minutes, I didn't even address my experience. And I think that speaks mounds about me. I don't even think I recognize how difficult it was for me to share experiences of my own, or perhaps I didn't really have a good understanding of it. And this class has definitely shed light on that for me. So, to explore it a little bit, my first objective was recognized, I think, in preparing for my courageous conversation. I spent a lot of time researching otherness as the subjective end of an oppressive binary in terms of gender identity and sexual identity. Looking into the challenges that this group of students faces, like all of the other culturally diverse groups regarding race, class, gender, and of course we're talking about gender roles. Yeah, it's pretty interesting to see, how transferable attitudes and behaviors and I guess inherent beliefs impact the way that we look at subjective groups of people, non-dominant groups of people, and the fact that it's fascinating that it transfers over to the educational institution. All the same, shouldn't shock us, but it shocked me. In institutional structures and education, we find that, even legislation, not only in the personal lives of this group, LGBT or non-gender conforming students, there are laws, literally laws in some places in this country that prohibit students from having, equal opportunity or equitable opportunities in the school systems. We could look at teacher attitudes, self-censorship, the training that's coming from academic institutions, higher education, that influence their attitudes and beliefs, and consequentially impact the way in which they conduct their practice that marginalizes these students. We could look at the curriculum and how it is structured in a way that caters to the dominant white male paradigm, I suppose. We can look at the exclusion of culturally diverse gifted peoples, especially LGBT. That is a huge taboo topic, especially in education, I feel like, and that may be changing. But from my understanding and from the research I've done, that's the impression that I'm getting. There's a lack of open role models, spaces for these students, and I think some of the issues that this group specifically faces is very much transferable to any culturally diverse gifted group. We could look at tracking, gifted assessment with teacher recommendations, parent recommendations, assessment and testing, and how standardized measures generalize groups of students and generalize the way in which we understand intelligence. And there's a lack of regard for diversity in the way that we structure questions and testing, not just diversity and the case of sexuality and gender identity, but with race and class. So it's really fascinating to take a good hard look at how oppressive institutional structures marginalize culturally diverse gifted students. The second objective was to analyze the influence of culturally unresponsive or responsive environments on the psychological, social, and emotional development of culturally diverse students and gifted programs. The personal example for me, in my experience, and this one's definitely closer to heart, would be preparing to share my peeps. And I write it in this way because it wasn't actually preparing to share my peeps that made me take a good hard look at, unresponsive environments on the development of these students, but it was sharing my peeps. And like I said before in the first objective, I'm not sure that I actually realized how impactful it was for me to share these things. I've always thought of myself as introverted. I can talk, but I'm definitely introverted, and there's not a lot I want to go into great length to share. Preparing to share my peeps, we all know at this point, I had a loss in the family at the time, and that was difficult, but it impacted me in, I guess, a way that I didn't expect. And going into the presentation and sharing my peeps with you, not only did I kind of have this shock on how I felt about a loss, but also about how families kind of shaped me and becoming who I am. And, maybe the senses were heightened at the time, and, I was going through an experience. But nevertheless, it made me look, at how culturally unresponsive environments impact psychological, social, and emotional development of culturally diverse students, because yes, I identify as a member of the LGBT community, which is a culturally diverse group of students that are marginalized in education and socially. Realizing that the influence of unresponsive environments on my own development, I just spoke to that. It was just a very fascinating experience for me. Institutionally, we don't recognize the voice of others, their experiences, their emotions. We have this rational approach to knowledge that serves the power of dominant groups, but is a disservice to those who are subjected and oppressed. Teachers have a choice between courage and fear with regard to controversy, and most of the time, especially in the context of non-gender conforming and LGBT students, gifted students, there's a huge fear of the controversy in talking about those issues. We can look at the curriculum, as I talked about in the last example, culturally diverse figures, exclusionary language, even attitudes that exclude this particular group of students. And again, these experiences are transferable to all different kinds of groups of culturally diverse students. And that really just spoke to the cultural diversity piece as opposed to the gifted piece. Again, gifted assessment, recommendations, all of these things are a huge impact on, students. So we need to have an understanding of those psychological, social, and emotional developments in the culturally diverse groups of students, especially those being assessed to be in gifted programs, because they impact the way in which we make those judgments. The second task in the 3 is, of course, to talk about our future plans. We're to identify 2 important changes, areas of growth, or reaffirmations related to the personal work engaged in, and discuss how they inform personal or professional objectives for future engagement and work with diversity and equity issues in gifted advanced programs. We know that I have very little experience in undergraduate education with education. I was indecisive. I made some decisions and changed my mind, and now, several years later, I'm back to get my master's and get certified as a teacher, and I wouldn't have it any other way. I really feel like my undergraduate experience was a disservice in comparison to what I've acquired, even in just one semester here at university, so I'm very appreciative of that. I've really enjoyed being here. And with regard to our multicultural gifted education class, there are 3 things that I consider in looking at or identifying personal important changes. Gifted assessment, curriculum, and the attitudes and beliefs of teachers. I'm really fascinated with gifted assessment. I have little experience with it. So being able to look at how teacher recommendations, parent recommendations, and the means or the ways in which we assess students to identify their giftedness. Not only that, but the ways in which we determine what giftedness even is. The complexities that go into that, the inequities that go into the way in which that structure exists. It's really fascinating to have studied, and it's definitely something I'm going to take to heart and take to work with regard to the way in which I work with culturally diverse gifted students. I have a lot of experience talking about curriculum and looking at historiography, because historiography challenges us to question the way everything is constructed, stories, grand narratives, etc., etc. And really, the curriculum is more or less a grand narrative. And in the case of multicultural gifted education, the curriculum has the capacity, and often does, exclude certain groups of people and completely disengage gifted students. And then, of course, attitudes and beliefs of teachers. Of course, I wouldn't come into this with the idea that all teachers have attitudes and beliefs that reflect a regard for equity issues for all students. But I really didn't have a good idea or a good backing for discussion to talk about how impactful these attitudes and beliefs are on practice. And it's just so important that teachers are unwaveringly accepting and supportive to all of their students, regardless of the diversity or level of intelligence, however you want to measure those things. So I'll go ahead and go into the rest of the conversation about future plans. And looking at the responses people had, I don't have it in front of me, so I'm not sure what to call it, but we commented on our perceptions of one another, what we learned from one another, etc., etc. People were curious about my transition to K-12 and asked how I will address social justice issues for the LGBT community. Another looked into or made note of my passion for history, and it's true, I do have a passion for history. And they want to know why I'm here. And the thing that spoke to me most was, why am I here? Because it's a question I've asked myself many, many times. I came to terms with the fact that I had a job a year ago that made at least 10 grand more than I will make every single year for at least a decade working in the field of education, or at least working as an educator. But for me, and if this says anything about my values and future plans, it's incredibly important for me to be able to do something that makes a difference and speaks to my values. And the work that I've done in the past does not speak to those values. It's very important that I do something that serves good for people, for the world. My transition to K-12, who knows? My interest really, I think, is to work in academia. Long-term goals, I would really love to be affiliated with a university and work as a teacher educator. And in order to do that, you have to have experience teaching in the K-12 setting. That's not to say that I don't have interest working in the K-12 setting. It's quite the opposite. But I won't deny that I'm not completely certain of what to expect from that experience. And I think that's okay. And who knows, I may fall in love with it, and it may be something that I want to do for the rest of my life. But who knows? And with regard to addressing social justice issues for the LGBT community, well, I think I spoke to that in looking into the objectives and preparing for my courageous conversation. Because in preparing for that, there was a lot to learn with regard to inequity for this particular group. So addressing social justice, something I definitely need to look into. I think safe spaces and being an open role model, that's a huge thing, and it's a question I've asked myself. If I go into the field and work as an educator, is that something that I would disclose? And I wasn't so sure before this class, but I know now that it's absolutely something that would have to be disclosed to be a good role model for students, and not to perpetuate those, attitudes that kind of, stuff that I experienced when I was a student. You want to kind of hide and keep it to yourself. And there are exceptions to that, but for me, it was very much the case. Passion for history, very much so. I'm going to go into teaching social studies. But my experience, even in social studies research throughout this first semester, has transformed the way that I'll look into teaching students social studies. And that plays very much into equity and critical thinking and questioning structures and constructions of knowledge that, marginalize any student for whatever reason, gifted, diverse. It's awesome. Okay, so the third of our tasks involves networking and collaboration. And for me, I chose 2 organizations rather than individuals, given I'm not really into all the networking communication on a professional level yet. To connect with, to promote an awareness of, and effectiveness in addressing race, class, gender, and/or linguistic diversity within the home, schools, and community settings. Why are they important? Of the 2 I chose the National Association for Gifted Children. Big, broad, sweeping, right? But for someone like me, who's getting their introduction, into multicultural gifted education, this was a huge resource, and I think it would be a great communication tool. Gay, lesbian, and straight education network played a huge role in the work that I've done on my Courageous Conversation. Okay, so we've all looked into the group for the National Association for Gifted Students, but the Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Education Network has been a huge resource to me, especially for my Courageous Conversation and doing research. There's a lot of opportunities here to learn, who are they? Let's talk about ed policy. Let's talk about legislative policies. They work with researchers. They have a staff of researchers that, work on publications and look at the issues in education, the impact of bullying, the climate of schools. You have the ability to join programs. Students can take action. There's gay straight alliances, and they encourage and show local chapters and help students connect. For teachers, there are resources. You can reference lesson plans. And just read general, literature on things that you can do to build a safe space for your students, professional development, and educator network. And of course, this is the most important thing here because I'm using this as an example of networking. And for me, this is a huge resource to reach out to allies, to reach out to other members of the LGBT community in an attempt to work together to promote equity and diversity. In our classrooms, especially for a taboo group of students. So, awesome. Just to give you guys an idea of what the site looks like here. Great. Okay, guys, so that concludes my oral final, and I hope you enjoyed it. This is my first experience playing with the new 2013 PowerPoint and including videos and mixes. So awesome. I look forward to working with you guys again. Good luck.